Hey, welcome to Black Justice Chronicles, where each story is a revolution of truth and resilience. Get ready for a journey that celebrates the power of justice. It all began with a loud pop, followed by the most glorious shriek Jack had ever heard. His entitled neighbor, Karen, was screaming as if her prized Gucci sneakers had just caught fire. In reality, it was her son's ATV Charger that had caught fire, and Jack couldn't help but feel a sense of karmic justice in the situation. After all, Karen had been stealing power from his system for weeks, despite Jack's warning that he was an electrical systems engineer who designed power infrastructure for data centers. Karen, however, had shrugged off Jack's warnings. "It's just a little juice," she'd said with a laugh, dismissing the matter as if it were no big deal. But for Jack, this wasn't just about power, this was a matter of principle. He knew she was taking advantage of his system, and he had already warned her. Now, he had decided that it was time for a little lesson in electricity. But before the pop and the shriek, things had started much more subtly. Jack wasn't just some guy tinkering with a multimeter and harboring a grudge. He was a certified systems engineer, and electricity was his passion. He loved designing systems, and when he noticed something strange on his home energy monitor, he knew something was wrong. The monitor had logged phantom drains during off-peak hours, something that didn't match up with any of Jack's appliances. As a meticulous engineer, he kept a close eye on his energy usage, and when he saw a 1.8 kilowatt-hours dip happening consistently between 1 o'clock and 3 a.m., he knew something was off. It wasn't his HVAC, his hot tub, or his backup battery cycling, it was an external power drain. At first, Jack didn't want to jump to conclusions, but the more he thought about it, the more he suspected his neighbor, Karen. She'd been living next door for 2 years after a messy divorce, and since then, she'd been a parade of poor decisions. From HOA violations that mysteriously never got enforced to making up new neighborhood rules on a whim, Karen's behavior had been nothing short of frustrating. But her most recent obsession had been an electric ATV for her teenage son, a noisy, obnoxious vehicle that ran on electricity and, Jack suspected, was being powered by his grid. One day while trimming his hedges, Jack noticed an orange extension cord slithering like a snake over the back fence and disappearing behind his tool shed. He blinked. This was impossible, he thought. He didn't have any outdoor outlets on that side of the house. No way would Karen be so bold as to run an extension cord through his property. But Jack wasn't convinced yet. He decided to turn off all his exterior breakers, leaving just one on, to see if he could catch the culprit. The next morning, Jack checked the logs, and sure enough, there was a dip in his power usage at exactly 2:12 a.m. He walked out to the fence line and, as he suspected, found the cord had been retracted and hidden. However, Jack had taken pictures of it. He decided it was time for a gentle confrontation. The next day, Jack knocked on Karen's door, expecting a simple misunderstanding. Maybe her son had plugged in the ATV charger by accident, right? But when Karen answered, wearing yoga pants and holding a mimosa, she acted as though it were no big deal. "Oh, that? We figured it was no biggie," she said dismissively, "just a little charge while we waited for our garage panel to be fixed." Jack tried to explain that this was theft, even if it seemed small, but Karen laughed it off. "Relax, you're such a tech guy," she said, brushing him off like he was being overdramatic. At that moment, Jack realized he wasn't just dealing with a neighbor who didn't understand power systems, he was dealing with someone who didn't respect boundaries, personal property, or common decency. So, Jack decided that it was time to take action, and it wouldn't be the kind of action Karen would expect. Jack's patience was wearing thin. After his confrontation with Karen, where she casually dismissed his concerns about her stealing power, he knew that something had to be done. He wasn't just some average homeowner, he was a certified systems engineer with a passion for power systems. Karen might have thought she was getting away with something small, but for Jack, it was a matter of principle. She had stolen power from him without consent, and now it was time to catch her red-handed. The first thing Jack did was begin closely monitoring his home energy usage, which he had already been tracking with a sophisticated home energy monitoring system. When the dips in power usage continued each night between 1 o'clock and 3 a.m., he realized that Karen's behavior wasn't just an isolated incident, it was a pattern. The consumption wasn't coming from any of his appliances, and it certainly wasn't the hot tub or HVAC system. Jack's system was meticulously calibrated, so if something didn't belong, it stood out like a sore thumb. His trained eye quickly determined that the drain was coming from somewhere else, and that somewhere else had to be Karen's household. Jack wasn't someone to act impulsively, he took a systematic approach to solving problems. He wasn't the type of person to make a mountain out of a molehill, but this had gone too far. He needed more than just vague suspicions, he needed evidence. The first step was to track down the source of the mysterious power drain. The more Jack thought about it, the more the picture started to form. Karen's recent obsession with the electric ATV her son had been using seemed like the perfect culprit. Not only did the vehicle run on electricity, but it was also a glaringly loud nuisance in the otherwise quiet neighborhood. If her son was charging it on Jack's grid without permission, it would explain the unexplained dips in power. But the real breakthrough came when Jack was trimming his hedges one day and noticed an orange extension cord snaking over the back fence and disappearing behind his tool shed. It was a subtle thing, but Jack's trained eye caught it immediately. This was no coincidence. He couldn't believe it at first, he didn't have any outdoor outlets on that side of the house, so how could a cord have appeared there? But then he realized, Karen had crossed a line. She had not only ignored his warning, but she had also assumed that he wouldn't notice. Jack couldn't allow this to go unchecked. He decided to investigate. That night, after shutting off all the exterior breakers on his property, he left just one running and waited for the inevitable. Sure enough, by 2:12 a.m., the logs registered a dip in power that matched the time when the extension cord had first appeared. Jack walked out to the fence line, following the trail of the cord as it snaked across his property, hidden just enough to be overlooked. But this time, Jack had come prepared. He'd taken photos of the cord, ensuring that if Karen denied it, he had physical proof of her power theft. The next day, Jack walked over to Karen's house, determined to resolve the issue without making a scene. Maybe it was all an accident, he thought. Maybe Karen's son had plugged the ATV in without realizing the cord was on his side of the fence. He rang the doorbell, and when Karen answered, she was wearing yoga pants and sipping on a mimosa, like she had all the time in the world. "Hi, Karen. I noticed a power drain happening every night around 2 a.m., and I was wondering if by any chance someone in your house had plugged something into my outlet," Jack asked politely. "Oh, that? Yeah, we figured it was no biggie," Karen responded, her tone casual. "Just a little charge while we waited for our garage panel to be fixed. You've got solar, right? You barely notice it." Jack tried to explain that it wasn't just about the inconvenience, it was theft, and theft of any kind, no matter how small, was unacceptable. But Karen brushed him off with a smile and a pat on the arm. "Relax, you're such a tech guy. It's not like we're draining your car battery or something." The dismissive way Karen responded made Jack's blood boil, but he kept his composure. He left her house with his mind already working on the next steps. He called the HOA to report the theft, but the response was less than encouraging. 3 days later, he received a warning letter, accusing him of creating hostile neighbor dynamics and making unauthorized modifications to shared structures. Karen had turned the situation around, spinning it into a complaint about him, something he wasn't about to let slide. The HOA's inability to act pushed Jack further into his own plan. This wasn't about being petty, this was about principle. If Karen wanted to play games, Jack was ready to level up. And he had a plan that was as ingenious as it was subtle. Jack sat in his workshop, a cup of tea cooling beside him as he sketched out the plan. The confrontation with Karen had left him fuming, and while he could have simply yelled at her or reported her again to the HOA, he knew that would be a waste of his time. Jack was a systems engineer, and if there was one thing he knew, it was how to make a plan that would work, quietly, efficiently, and with a bit of technical flair. He thought about the problem Karen had created. She hadn't just stolen a little bit of power, she had taken advantage of his expertise and blatantly disregarded his warning. It was as if she saw herself as untouchable, above the rules, even in a neighborhood that thrived on conformity. But Jack was done being the quiet guy in the corner. He wasn't just going to let her keep stealing his power with no consequences. After much contemplation, Jack decided on his course of action. He would create a trap, but it would be more than just a simple trick. It needed to be clever, subtle, and above all, legal. It needed to show Karen the consequences of taking what wasn't hers, but in a way that left no room for denial. Jack had spent his entire career designing power systems, ensuring that the infrastructure he built was foolproof. Now, he would put that knowledge to use on his own backyard. The first step was creating the perfect decoy outlet. Jack knew that Karen wouldn't be able to resist the temptation of plugging in her ATV charger again. So, he rigged a fake outlet on his side of the fence. It looked unguarded, easy to use, and most importantly, completely legal. He wanted to make sure that Karen never saw the trap coming. But behind the seemingly innocent outlet was a carefully crafted surprise. A surge-protected circuit designed to fry anything that tried to draw more than 3 amps. Jack spent the next few hours perfecting the wiring. The outlet would appear to be a simple, unmodified junction, just like many others in the neighborhood. He made sure that it was perfectly positioned, just visible enough to be enticing, but not so obvious that Karen would immediately realize something was off. The idea was that when she plugged her ATV charger in again, she'd think it was just another harmless charge. But this time, the results would be very different. Once the outlet was installed, Jack moved on to the next stage, monitoring. He wasn't about to leave anything to chance. Jack connected the new outlet to his home server, making sure he could track every usage of it in real time. He set up alerts for any power draws above a specific threshold, so he would know the exact moment the outlet was used. Next, he added a little insurance in the form of a hidden data logger. The logger would timestamp every instance of the outlet being used, recording every detail, voltage draw, time of usage, and even the specific current flow. If Karen or her son tried to use the outlet again, Jack would have everything he needed to prove it. He wasn't just going to let her off the hook this time. As an extra layer of security, Jack added motion-activated cameras. He had a few unused cameras from a previous home security project, and he repurposed them for this task. They would blend seamlessly with the surroundings, camouflaged as birdhouses and floodlights. The cameras would monitor the fake outlet, the corner of Karen's yard where her ATV usually sat, and the area around the fence line. Jack wanted complete visibility of the entire situation. With everything in place, Jack could only wait. He sipped his tea as he glanced at the setup. The trap was simple, effective, and nearly invisible. It would be the perfect way to catch Karen in the act. 3 days passed, and Jack began to wonder if Karen had learned her lesson. He almost thought she might back off. But then, just as he had suspected, on the 4th night, the logs started to spike. His server pinged him with a notification, power draw detected. The outlet had been used. Jack smiled. It was time. The waiting game was always the hardest part for Jack. After setting the perfect trap, he found himself pacing in his workshop, staring at the monitor and waiting for the moment he knew would come. He'd set everything up precisely, an unassuming decoy outlet on his side of the fence, rigged to send a surge through any device that plugged into it. The cameras were ready, the data logger was primed, and Jack was positioned perfectly to catch Karen and her son in the act. For the first few days, there was no sign of activity. Jack kept himself busy with other projects, but in the back of his mind, he couldn't shake the anticipation. His home energy monitor had shown no unusual spikes, and the log remained steady. Maybe Karen had finally backed off. Maybe she had learned her lesson. But Jack knew better. People like Karen, who felt entitled to take what wasn't theirs, didn't learn easily. He suspected that it was only a matter of time before she tried again. And then it happened. 3 nights later, Jack was sitting in his workshop, sipping on a mug of tea when he heard the familiar ping of an alert on his phone. His server had detected a power draw. He glanced at the timestamp, 2:17 a.m. The exact time when Karen's son had plugged in his ATV the last few times. Jack smiled to himself. It was showtime. He walked to the back of the house, quietly moving toward the workshop's window, where he had a clear view of the decoy outlet. There, across the fence, Jack could see the familiar orange extension cord snaking its way from Karen's side of the property. He could barely make out the silhouette of Karen's son in his boxers, fumbling with the plug. It was happening again. Jack stayed silent, watching as the boy plugged the cord into the decoy outlet, just like Jack had predicted. It was almost too easy. For a moment, Jack considered rushing over and confronting him right then, but he resisted the urge. The trap had been set, and he wanted to see it through. Just as expected, the moment the ATV charger started drawing power, the circuit triggered. There was a bright blue flash followed by a loud pop that echoed through the stillness of the night. Jack couldn't help but feel a surge of satisfaction as he watched the chaos unfold. Karen's son jumped back in shock, stumbling away from the now smoking charger. The ATV, which had been running fine only moments before, was now billowing smoke like a Halloween prop. Karen's son stood frozen for a moment, unsure of what to do. Then he sprinted back into the house, yelling for his mother. Jack could hear the frantic calls through the fence, but he stayed still, waiting. Karen's dramatic shriek soon followed, piercing the night air like a siren. Jack couldn't help but smile. This was exactly what she deserved. She'd stolen power without permission, and now she was getting a taste of her own medicine. From his vantage point, Jack saw Karen storming outside, her face contorted in anger. She was yelling at her son, who seemed equally confused and upset. He had no idea what had just happened, but Karen surely knew it wasn't just a coincidence. Her son's precious ATV charger was fried, and she knew who was responsible. Jack waited, watching them try to figure out the damage. Karen's shrill voice echoed through the backyard as she cursed Jack's name, blaming him for sabotaging her son's charger. But Jack was unfazed. He'd sent a message without having to utter a single word. He watched as Karen's son, now shirtless and confused, tried to unplug the smoking charger, but it was too late. The damage had been done. The ATV was unusable, and the charging unit was fried beyond repair. It wasn't just a victory for Jack, it was a moment of karmic justice. For weeks, Karen had arrogantly taken what wasn't hers, assuming she could get away with it. She had dismissed Jack's warnings, even belittled his expertise. And now, here she was, the victim of her own hubris. After a few moments, Karen stomped back into the house, muttering angrily. Jack remained still, savoring the moment. He didn't need to confront her right away. He had already won. The power theft had been caught, and the lesson had been learned, at least, Jack hoped. As Jack made his way back to his workshop, he couldn't help but reflect on the irony of it all. He had set the trap, but it wasn't just about power, this was about respect. Karen had crossed the line, and Jack had made sure that she would remember not to mess with someone who knew how to defend their turf. But Jack wasn't celebrating yet. This was just the first strike. He knew Karen wouldn't take this lying down, and the battle was far from over. But for now, Jack allowed himself a small, satisfied smile. The lesson had been delivered, and the next round was on the horizon. The following morning, Jack could hear the unmistakable sounds of Karen pacing outside. He could only imagine what she was saying, her screams from the night before still echoing in his ears. He didn't need to look out the window to know she was furious. Her son's electric ATV charger was toast, and Karen had to know exactly who was responsible. Jack, however, was already anticipating the fallout. He had expected Karen to lash out. After all, she was never one to take responsibility for her actions, especially when she was caught doing something illegal. But Jack was ready for whatever came next. He knew that Karen wouldn't let this slide, she would escalate things. But he also knew that his own actions were above reproach. He had followed the rules, built his systems correctly, and had every bit of evidence to back up his claims. The first sign that things were about to get ugly came when Jack heard the heavy stomping of footsteps approaching his door. He opened it to find Karen standing on his doorstep, her expression one of pure rage. Gone was the mimosa and the carefree attitude she had displayed earlier. Now, she was the picture of indignation. "You did this," she yelled, her voice high-pitched and trembling with fury. "You fried my son's charger. I'm going to sue you, you'll see. This is vandalism. This is sabotage." Jack took a deep breath, trying to remain calm. "Karen, I don't know what you're talking about," he said evenly, though he was holding back a smile. "All I did was ensure that no one was stealing power from me." Karen's eyes narrowed. "Don't play dumb. I saw you looking out the window last night. You knew exactly what was going on, and you let it happen." Jack didn't flinch. He knew what she was doing, trying to intimidate him, trying to manipulate the situation to make him the villain. But Jack wasn't about to let that happen. "Karen, I warned you not to plug anything into my system without permission. I told you that it was illegal. And yet, you ignored me. Now, here we are." She scoffed, shaking her head. "You're ridiculous. You think just because you know a little bit about electricity that you're some sort of authority around here? You think you can just get away with whatever you want?" Jack's patience was wearing thin, but he held his ground. "I'm not the one who's been stealing electricity from my neighbors, Karen. You're the one who's been running a charging station off of my grid. That's theft, and it's against the law." Before Karen could respond, the sound of a car engine broke through the tension. Jack looked past her to see a car pulling into his driveway. It was the HOA representative, another one of Karen's minions, no doubt. Jack could feel his frustration mounting. He had dealt with Karen's antics for too long, and now it seemed the HOA was backing her up, just as he had feared. The HOA representative stepped out of the car with a clipboard in hand. He was a middle-aged man in khakis and a golf shirt, clearly trying to look professional, but his air of smugness was unmistakable. He had that look, one that said he thought he was about to lay down the law on Jack. "You can't just install unauthorized electrical devices along a shared boundary," the HOA representative said, his voice dripping with condescension. "This is a violation of the HOA guidelines. Karen has every right to complain about this." Jack raised an eyebrow, resisting the urge to roll his eyes. "What exactly is the violation, exactly? This outlet is on my property, wired to code, and perfectly legal." The HOA representative looked momentarily flustered. "That's not the point. You've created a hazardous situation. You've put everyone's safety at risk." Jack's jaw tightened. "This is a simple outlet, installed legally. It's not hazardous. If anyone is at fault here, it's the person who's been stealing power from me. Karen is the one who's been using unauthorized power, not me." The HOA representative seemed momentarily taken aback, but he quickly regained his composure. "We'll be conducting a review. In the meantime, I suggest you remove the outlet to avoid further escalation." Jack stood firm. "I'll remove it when Karen stops stealing power from my system. Until then, I suggest you start enforcing the rules fairly and consistently, instead of playing favorites." Karen huffed, but Jack wasn't done yet. "You know, I could have simply reported this to the local utility company," he said, his voice calm and controlled. "This is theft, and I have the footage to prove it. If you want to escalate things, I'm happy to go down that route." The HOA representative's eyes widened slightly, and Jack could see that the wind had been taken out of his sails. "Well, we'll need to review everything," the man muttered, scribbling something down on his clipboard. Jack didn't wait for him to finish. "Good," he said with a smile. "Take your time." As the representative walked back to his car, Jack could see Karen standing there, fuming. She was defeated, and Jack knew it. She might not have admitted it yet, but she knew she had crossed a line. She had tried to take advantage of his power, and now she was paying the price. Jack wasn't celebrating yet. He knew this wasn't over. Karen was stubborn, and the HOA wasn't about to let her go down without a fight. But Jack had a plan, and he was ready for whatever came next. The next few days felt like a series of escalating chess moves between Jack and Karen, with each one trying to outwit the other. After the HOA representative's visit, Jack was almost certain that Karen would escalate things even further. But what he didn't expect was the reaction from the rest of the neighborhood. The following morning, as Jack sipped his coffee in the kitchen, he saw Karen through his window, pacing back and forth in her yard. Her usual carefree swagger was replaced by a visible frustration. She was talking on the phone, likely with someone from the HOA, but Jack couldn't make out her words. He didn't need to. Her body language told the story. Karen was trying to reclaim control, trying to get the HOA to side with her once again. But Jack was ready for her. When Jack stepped outside later that morning, he was greeted by several neighbors who had never really spoken to him much before. Tom, who lived 2 houses down and had an outdoor kitchen Jack had helped install, waved him over. He was a jovial guy, always hosting barbecues, but today there was something different in his eyes. "Hey, Jack," Tom began, lowering his voice as if to make sure no one was listening. "I gotta be honest, I've been meaning to talk to you about something." Jack raised an eyebrow. "Sure, what's up?" "I think you're right about Karen. She's been stealing power from a lot of people," Tom said. "I've noticed some weird dips in my power usage too, especially around 2 a.m. It's been happening for months, but I thought it was just my system. Turns out I was wrong. I've had some issues with the fridge running hot at night, and after seeing what you've been dealing with, I'm pretty sure I'm next." Jack was taken aback by Tom's admission. He had known Tom for a while but had never expected him to come forward. "You're not the only one," Jack said, his voice steady. "I've been tracking it for weeks now. It's not just me, Karen's been siphoning power from anyone she can." As Tom and Jack exchanged stories, Nancy, a quiet neighbor who always waved but rarely spoke, approached them with a knowing look. "I've been having problems too," she said, almost shyly. "My garden lights flicker all the time. I thought it was just a wiring issue, but now that I'm hearing what happened with you too, I'm wondering." Jack nodded. "I think it's been happening to a lot of people, Nancy. We just didn't have the evidence until now." This was the moment Jack had been waiting for. He had expected resistance from the HOA, but what he hadn't expected was this kind of support from his neighbors. It felt like the entire neighborhood had been quietly suffering from Karen's behavior, but now, with the power theft exposed, people were starting to speak up. In the days that followed, more neighbors came to Jack with similar stories: strange dips in their electricity usage, unexplained power outages, and even one instance of a neighbor's freezer thawing out while they were away on vacation. It became clear that Karen wasn't just stealing from Jack. She had been running a network of power theft across the entire block. Her son had plugged into unlocked outlets, garden ports, and even an RV hookup while its owner was away. Jack knew he had to do something. This wasn't just about him anymore, it was about the entire neighborhood. The problem wasn't just Karen's selfishness, it was her sense of entitlement and complete disregard for the rules that others had to follow. This was about standing up to someone who had thought they could take whatever they wanted without facing any consequences. Jack organized a neighborhood meeting, inviting everyone who had been affected by Karen's power theft. The group chat they had formed, initially just a few people sharing their frustrations, grew exponentially in the coming days. By the time the meeting took place, there were 23 members in the chat, and more were joining every day. People were talking openly about Karen's behavior, and the more they shared, the more evidence they accumulated. On the night of the meeting, Jack arrived early at the community clubhouse. He had a stack of screenshots, logs, and footage of Karen's son sneaking into his yard and plugging in the charger. Jack wasn't the only one who had footage now. Many of his neighbors had installed their own monitoring systems after learning about the power theft. It was time for the neighborhood to take action. When the meeting began, it wasn't the typical dull HOA session about flower beds and patio color schemes. This time, it was a full-on confrontation. Karen, sitting at the front of the room, was visibly tense. Her arms were crossed, and her face was tight with irritation. She could feel the heat from the other residents' eyes. As the meeting progressed, Jack and his neighbors took turns presenting their evidence. They showed the logs, the footage, and the testimonies that proved Karen's theft. Tom, Nancy, and others spoke about their experiences, pointing out how Karen had been using their electricity to power everything from her son's ATV to mini-fridges, karaoke machines, and even a backyard party setup. Karen tried to defend herself, claiming that everything was just a misunderstanding, that it was all innocent. "I didn't know it would be such a big deal," she said, trying to play the victim. But no one was buying it. Jack had provided too much evidence, and even Greg, the HOA president and one of Karen's former allies, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. The bombshell came when one neighbor presented their power bill for the last year, showing inexplicable spikes in usage that coincided with Karen's late-night activities. The HOA couldn't ignore it any longer. They couldn't turn a blind eye to Karen's behavior. After a heated discussion, the board voted unanimously to suspend Karen's HOA privileges, pending a full investigation. As Karen stormed out of the meeting, nearly knocking over the punch table in her fury, Jack couldn't help but feel a small sense of victory. This wasn't over yet, but for the first time, it seemed like Karen's reign of entitlement had come to an end. The neighborhood had come together, and the response had been swift, precise, and unrelenting. Jack had been the catalyst for change, but it was the collective effort of the entire community that had made the difference. The fallout from the HOA meeting was swift and powerful. After Karen's suspension, Jack had hoped she would retreat into the shadows, but he knew better. People like Karen didn't back down easily. They never accepted defeat. Sure enough, Karen was back to her usual antics, this time doubling down on her behavior. The HOA suspension didn't seem to faze her, in fact, it seemed to fuel her sense of self-righteousness. In the days following the meeting, Jack noticed more of Karen's behavior shifting from subtle manipulation to outright defiance. She had begun to plant herself in the center of neighborhood events, attempting to dominate the narrative, like a defiant queen who'd lost her crown. Jack could see the tension in her every movement, the way she stomped around the yard with her arms crossed, glaring at her neighbors, who were now growing more unified in their distaste for her actions. Jack wasn't surprised. People like Karen had a way of spinning everything back into a personal vendetta. They loved playing the victim, especially when confronted with the consequences of their own actions. What Jack didn't expect was how she would escalate her response. She didn't just want to remain a part of the community, she wanted revenge. And that's exactly what she started plotting. One afternoon, while Jack was trimming his hedges, he saw Karen slip something under the fence. It was a small item, too small to be noticed from a distance, but as Jack moved closer, he saw what it was, a thin, barely visible wire connected to the side of her shed, stretching across the yard. It was strange, but Jack didn't think much of it at first. After all, she'd already caused enough trouble with her power theft. But when he saw her sneak inside and close the door behind her, Jack's instincts told him that something wasn't right. Karen had gone from defiant to sneaky. That evening, Jack decided to do some recon. He'd been tracking the power usage from his solar system and decided to monitor his electricity draw as usual, making sure there were no oddities. As the night wore on, he checked his logs. Sure enough, there was a strange spike in power use, right around 2:30 a.m. It wasn't enough to be noticed by his standard systems, but it was still there, a subtle disturbance in the flow. Jack's heart sank. He had known Karen wouldn't back off so easily. So, Jack did what any engineer would do, he investigated. He waited until the next night, setting up a few additional sensors on his property to see if he could catch her in the act. He watched from his window as Karen and her son, under the cover of darkness, started tampering with something near the fence. The small wire he had seen earlier had now been connected to an external outlet that appeared to be on her property. Jack's suspicion was confirmed. Karen was attempting to bypass his security measures and siphon power again. Without hesitation, Jack clicked into his monitoring system. He wasn't about to let her get away with this again. This time, he had more than just footage. He had built-in triggers that would catch anything that drew more than a specified amount of electricity, and once it did, it would trigger a protective mechanism that would neutralize whatever device she plugged in. The trap was set. Jack waited. Within minutes, the power spike appeared on his log. And just as expected, there was a bright flash of light outside his window. Jack smiled grimly. The surge protection worked perfectly, and Karen's sneaky power grab was halted. Jack immediately documented the entire event, the spike in power, the time of the surge, and the exact moment it occurred. This time, there would be no question about Karen's actions. The morning after the latest surge, Jack woke up early, his mind already on the next steps. Karen's latest attempt to steal power had been caught again, but he knew she wouldn't give up. People like her never did. This time, Jack had the data, the evidence, and the video footage to prove her continued theft. He was prepared to take things to the next level, especially now that she had crossed the line again. As Jack sat with his coffee, he saw Karen pacing outside, once again muttering into her phone. It was clear that she had no intention of learning from her mistakes. He noticed that she was speaking in a more defensive tone than usual, as if she was preparing for an attack. Jack knew that once Karen realized the jig was up, she would escalate things even further, and that meant he had to act fast. He spent the rest of the morning compiling all the evidence into a neat, well-documented report. It wasn't just about the stolen power anymore, it was about her entire pattern of behavior. Jack had already gathered footage, time-stamped logs, and even the backup data that proved Karen had been siphoning power for months. This wasn't an isolated incident, it was a campaign of theft that had gone unnoticed until now. Jack decided to take it to the HOA, but this time, he wasn't asking for a review or a warning. He was going to make them see the full scope of the situation. Jack walked to the HOA office that afternoon, armed with his report and the full evidence. As he handed it to Janice, the office clerk, he could see the surprised look on her face as she flipped through the pages. There was no denying it now, Karen had been taking advantage of the entire neighborhood's power grid, and Jack had the proof to back it up. Later that evening, Karen approached Jack, her face red with anger. "You've done it now," she spat. "You've made a bigger mistake than you know." Jack didn't flinch. "The mistake was yours from the beginning, Karen. You stole from me, from everyone in this neighborhood, and now it's time to face the consequences." By the time the HOA convened to address the latest complaint, Jack was ready. He had presented his findings, solid proof of Karen's theft, and a detailed record of the power surges she had caused. The board members were visibly uncomfortable as they reviewed the evidence, and Jack could tell that even Karen's once loyal allies were starting to have second thoughts. The meeting dragged on, but the inevitable happened. The HOA president, Greg, who had always been a staunch defender of Karen, couldn't ignore the evidence. "Karen, we've received serious complaints," he said, his voice wavering slightly. "You've been stealing electricity from your neighbors, and we can't just ignore this anymore." Karen's eyes widened in shock. She had thought she could talk her way out of this, as she always did, but this time, the situation was different. The evidence was too overwhelming. She tried to argue, but her words fell on deaf ears. The board voted to suspend her HOA privileges permanently, and a fine was imposed. After the meeting, Karen left in a huff, her face a mask of fury. But Jack felt a sense of quiet satisfaction. The neighborhood had come together to stop her, and in doing so, they had taken back their sense of community. Karen had tried to tear it apart, but now, she was the one left on the outside. In the weeks following Karen's downfall, Jack noticed a subtle shift in the neighborhood. People who had once kept to themselves started chatting more often. Neighbors who had been too afraid to stand up to Karen now gathered in small groups, sharing stories, tips, and even a laugh or two. It was as though the weight of Karen's constant surveillance and manipulation had been lifted, and now, everyone could finally breathe. Jack spent his evenings on his porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon, sipping tea, and enjoying the peace that had returned. The birds sang, the breeze was gentle, and for the first time in a long while, Jack didn't feel the need to be constantly on alert. The neighborhood felt like a real community again, one where people actually cared about each other. Karen, meanwhile, was a shell of the person she had once been. Her reputation was tarnished beyond repair, and her once thriving social circle had evaporated. She had tried to rebuild her image with a few half-hearted attempts at gardening and making small talk with the neighbors, but it was no use. No one was interested in rekindling a relationship with the woman who had tried to steal from them for so long. One day, Jack heard a knock on his door. He opened it to find Karen standing on the other side, her face pale, her eyes tired. "I just wanted to say. I'm sorry," she muttered, her voice barely above a whisper. Jack looked at her for a moment, unsure how to respond. He had won, but he wasn't sure if forgiveness was in the cards. Still, he nodded slightly. "You should have asked in the first place," he said simply. Karen nodded, turning slowly to leave. For Jack, the silence that followed felt like the final piece of the puzzle falling into place. Peace had returned to the neighborhood, and Jack had done it without ever raising his voice. The battle was over, and Jack had emerged victorious, not just for himself, but for everyone who had been affected by Karen's actions. The neighborhood was stronger now, united in a way it had never been before.